So thank you, Renos. So I have many questions. The first is, what are the key principles we should keep in mind when we are working with people living trauma because of dislocation or migration?
Yes. Yeah. Well, there are so many, but let me try to summarize some key principles. First of all, we need to remember that involuntary dislocation is not just only geographical. People, yes, as a result of violence, a result of different types of upheavals or adversity, need to move from one location, physical location, to the other. But of course, what they are changing is not only location, is not only geographical place and that they change. They change whole lifestyles. They change. They disconnect from a whole environment of living that is associated with all facets of their lives, from family attachments and emotional investments, to people and places, to anything we can imagine, spiritual, historical, geographical. People are attached to geographical locations, they are attached to objects. So the change is quite radical, is quite a huge transformation. It is important to remember that these changes are not going to result exclusively in negative outcomes. Because when we think about all of these changes, in effect they are losses. Immediately when we associate loss with something negative, and there are negative effects, there's no question about it, there are negative effects. However, we need to also appreciate that when people involuntarily need to abandon their own spaces that they consider homes, they also have opportunities for developing something new and possibly more appropriate and more fitting with their own level of development, as well as abandoning certain practices. For example, you know, women who were oppressed in a certain place and they go into another place, they lose a lot of positive things, but they gain, for example, new opportunities of living in a more decent, dignified life with their rights. So inevitably we're thinking of losses and something negative, and we need to consider these. And these are not just only psychological, but are also financial, they are social, they are spiritual, there are all sorts of things. That's the first thing. But also we need to keep in mind that these situations also create opportunities for new forms of development. And it's important for us to have a framework that can contain both, because usually under the emotional pressure and the pressing needs of these phenomena, we think only of the negative ones. And by doing that, we're depriving people of making use of all the positive opportunities that these situations create. And of course, we need to be extremely sensitive, because you cannot just simply say to people, isn't it wonderful, you know, you have been dislocated and now you'll have a, you know, I mean, so we need to be very sensitive about how we perceive, and when we see the actual positive changes, and how sensitively to handle these.
So what you're saying is connected with resilience? Indeed, yes. Of course, there are many definitions of resilience. One that I find most convincing and the most tangible one is the definition of resilience as the retaining what we retain, positive things we retain from a time before the adversity struck, before the dislocation.
So if people were able to look after each other and care for their children, or they had a sense of humor or something like that, and that those qualities or relationships or types of functions continue later, those are resilient functions. I find it very difficult to think about a resilient person. And I know in the literature people talk about resilient people and vulnerable people. Every person is both resilient in certain ways and vulnerable in other ways. And I think our task as professionals is to really distinguish, differentiate these shades and of vulnerability and shades of resilience, of the positive things that have been retained. So yes, this is what I'm talking about. The idea of looking at both the gains and losses, so to speak, to put it crudely, refers to the resilience. Yes, what are the resilient functions that are retained and people are still able to continue their lives with them, and this is the idea that we need to identify them in an appropriate way and bring them into play, so to speak, activate them so that they see themselves as a whole human being and not just only as people who have been damaged.
Can you tell me about the synergic intervention?
Synergic intervention. Yes. Well, the synergic intervention is basically following on what we have just said. For us, workers, psychotherapists, but not only psychotherapists, people who work from whatever kind of capacity with these people, we need to connect our own efforts to help them with the helpful parts in them, with the resilient parts in them. So in other words, so we work synergically. In other words, the opposite of that would be to try to fix them because they're damaged. You fix, a computer because it's damaged. But when you're working with a human being, that human being is not just damaged, also retains some positive characteristics and functions from their previous time before the migration, before the adversity, etc., etc. So we need to identify that in an appropriate way, and we need to work with that. So that idea of synergy is connecting my energy with their energy together. So connecting our efforts together, working collaboratively with their healthy parts, so to speak, instead of seeing them exclusively as damaged people that we need to fix and there is nothing in them. So the idea of synergic intervention is that and it's an intervention that identifies the strengths in a person and finds ways of activating those strengths in that person in an appropriate way. And when I'm talking about the strengths, I was mentioning the resilient parts, which are the existing strengths that they retained from previously. However, there is another positive, a huge positive segment, so to speak, still in these people that is activated as a result of being exposed to that adversity. I was very moved a few days ago when I was working in Mexico City with you, and we heard stories about young people after the earthquake who even they lost themselves, actually not only young, people who although they lost a lot of things themselves, they were out there to help others. And these were people who were not particularly caring before. So that adversity brought them together. That adversity activated in them some sense of community, some sense of responsibility for others. So these are new positive things that are activated specifically from the exposure to adversity, and this is what I call adversity-activated development. Adversity-activated development. Development that has been activated specifically from the exposure to adversity. So these are new positives that they did not have before, and they have activated them. The adversity has activated them, and we need to identify the old positive, so to speak, the existing positive, as well as the new positive, and work together with them. And that is the idea of the synergic intervention, working with them, and to, first of all, to help them realize that these things are there. Because to begin with, most people are feeling the pain, they're feeling the loss, and they're just talking about that and nothing else. And we need to listen to that, we need to understand that, but in addition to also help them see their totality, so not to dissociate them in a sense, but help them see not only one part of them, but their totality. That includes the existing strengths as well as the newly acquired strengths as a result of the adversity.
How this intervention fits with the usual way people use to attend these the trauma issues, or to working with trauma?
Right. Well, I would say that all good interventions include, consciously or unconsciously, explicitly or implicitly, these elements. The approach that I'm talking about, the synergic interventions, is more explicit about this framework that helps people realize from the beginning that in addition to the pain, disorientation, suffering, etc., and the trauma from the losses, there is something else that they should keep an eye to identify. So it is important to have that in the framework from the beginning. We do not immediately introduce it, but it's important to keep it in mind, and then at the right time and in a sensitive way to bring it up. If we do not do that, then we fall into the trap of focusing exclusively on the negative effects, and in effect we keep repeating, in a sense, the traumatization. It sounds a little bit strong, but in effect that's what it is. Because if we look at the person only one part of them, their damaged part, so to speak, and we reinforce only their damaged part, and we're there just to fix that and nothing else, and we do not expose them, we don't help them see their own strengths, the existing strengths and the new strengths that they have acquired, then we're dealing with half of the human being, so we're one part of the human being. And that is why it's important for this approach to keep in mind as a framework the totality of a human being, and therefore the totality of our own interventions, and for the helpers, the people who work in this field, not to fall into the trap of just being fixers of the other person, of their damage and nothing else. So it requires some humility from us and some openness from us to also acknowledge the greatness and the resourcefulness of these people, because they have it. They forget it under the emotional strain of their losses. So we're there to help them reconnect with what is already in them, that they do have some resources, and like these young people, but these are examples that we see everywhere, wherever there is adversity, this resourcefulness will be activated.
Yes.
And it's important to keep that. So in a sense, it is a holistic approach to work with the whole person, and not only with their trauma, not only with their psychology, but respect that they have other perspectives, and it connects overall with the human dignity.
Yes. Well,
and it's a more dignified way of working with them. Yeah.
Thank you, Renos.
Thank you.
Generosity to share with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. It's wonderful to be back.
Yes.
Thank you.